we have to change the way we think about disciplines. Either we call it cross-disciplinary or post-disciplinary or anything else. We have to change the way we think about disciplines, and particularly the way we think about how nature and society are interwoven, and the way we think about nature. Already there we see a strong critique of the Western way of splitting society and nature, and how society is supposed to handle nature as a resource for our own development. So the Western knowledge has over hundreds of years developed this cleavage between social science, humanities science, and natural science, which probably has to change if we are going to reach our goals. And the report is also concerned about ways of knowing. That is, we have to have look at knowledge as intersubjective, something that keeps a dialogue between us as humans going, and not as knowledge as thing, something that is produced, made into a commodity that's either sold or something that is distributed. And ways of knowing does not end in something that is known. It's a continuous process. It's not a product, but an intersubjective process of gaining knowledge. And it argues that we gain this knowledge through intercultural dialogue today, to be able to recapture or regain the lost knowledges that are so important for our development today. We just had a start on day 0 about new technologies and how they are going to save us, which is, there was a lot of critical voices against that. But if you instead talk about regaining the lost knowledges about this earth, you might have a much greater process than the focus on new technologies in the West that will anyhow only lead to more of the same kind of industrialization, the same kind of power centers of knowledge. And the third is that we need to know, academics at universities, the third point of this report, is to become much more vocal in society. We have to take much higher responsibility for the knowledge we have and the knowledge we have developed, and show the value of this knowledge for our future. How the knowledge we develop is a precondition for changes that are necessary in this threatened world. We cannot produce knowledge and leave it to the society to use it as it likes. It may end in catastrophe. We have to take ethical responsibility for the knowledge we develop. We have to be much more active voice in society. So I'm just mentioning these 3 points as a starting point, and we notice that the decolonization topic is in the center of this debate, the ways of knowing, which presupposes a global interaction in the knowledge development. So with these few words, I would like to give the word to José Franz at the University of the Western Cape. I expect that each and every one, when they talk, just say briefly who they are and where they come from, and that they then gives a few words about what they are about this topic. So Franz, Professor Franz, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Tor. Good afternoon, everybody. I am very conscious of the fact that I'm sitting here in South Africa. And we are, experiencing load shedding here in South Africa. So this topic of decolonizing epistemologies or decolonizing knowledge and SDGs is so appropriate that you're sitting in the north and we're sitting here in the south, talking about one common topic, but yet we're sitting in different contexts in terms of how we experiencing what we are going through right now. But that's a topic for another day. Torres basically did half of my speech that I was going to start off with, but the clear component that I would want to highlight is that the document that we are referring to here this afternoon, Knowledge-Driven Action, Transforming Higher Education for Global Sustainability, is an important document, and I consider it an important guide in terms of the conversations that we have in the higher education sector. The one thing that I continuously highlight about the document is that we need to consider the voices from the South and how this impacts what it is that we do and how we talk about knowledge production and knowledge translation. Because context, I think, is important in terms of how we do research and how we are going to address the SDGs moving forward. We know that in our context, in the South African context, there's been a whole discussion around decolonizing of the curriculum, which came about for various reasons. And being engaged in the process of decolonizing the curriculum, the question I continuously ask is, are we including communities and other societal actors in this whole process of decolonizing the curriculum? Or is it still a top-down approach of the higher education sector that continues to dictate what a curriculum should look like in the higher education sector? Or do we recognize that there are other role players that are able to play and contribute to where it is that we are wanting to go when we talk about moving and influencing in the space of SDGs? I realize that to reach SDG goals by 2030, we have 7 years left. 7 years, what is it that we would like to achieve in the 7 years? I understand that it's important to understand what decolonizing epistemologies or decolonizing knowledge really is, but how does that look in the practical aspect? And how can we start talking about practical implications in our context? And how do we share best practice of these practical implications to be able to facilitate and move this SDG goal faster, to reach this SDG goal faster than what we are? I don't think we're going to reach the goals by 2030, but there needs to be some way that we can make an impact in terms of what we are doing. My second point I want to make is achieving the SDG goals will not happen, as I've said, if the voices from the South and solutions from the South relevant to our specific context is not heard. And I think that is an important aspect that we need to highlight and we need to emphasize, because solutions for Africa cannot be given from Europe. I'm not saying that what happens in the North is not applicable to the South, but we need to understand the context and see how we can have conversations in order to make this work for us. My third point I want to highlight is that we cannot find solutions for societies without societies. As a health professional, and my background is in physiotherapy, we talk about interprofessional education, which means we learn about, with, and from each other. And so in unpacking decolonizing knowledge and SDGs, we as colleagues from the North and from the South, we need to talk about each other, with each other, and we need to learn from each other so that we can come up with this knowledge production that is a central point of discussion for everybody in the spaces in which we find ourselves. And my last point I want to make is, when we talk about decolonizing knowledge and SDGs, this is my pet project, is around collaboration rather than competition. This is key when unpacking what decolonizing epistemologies and SDGs really mean to us. We operate in a world where competition is great. That is what we were grounded in. Whether you come to South Africa, or whether you go to Norway, or whether you go to the US, there's always this competition around things. Can we change the narrative? Can we start talking differently when we speak about knowledge production? Can we talk about how do we collaborate rather than compete in terms of discussing these important topics? I think I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much for this. Let me just say that the two of us have planned this workshop together, and so we already have a fairly strong North-South collaboration going. And we will get back to you as we discuss. I also must mention that anybody can raise their hand as we go along if they want to intervene, and we will have good time for discussion after the different talks. So if it's Ulf Iversen, are you here? I want to give the word to Ulf Iversen if you are there. There you are. Ulf, hear me?
You mean
Yes.
me?
Yes,
Okay.
I mean you. Yeah, so sorry, I said the word wrong, your name wrong. I'm sorry. But give you a short presentation of yourself and then a short talk. And we try to go north-south here all the time. So we now move to Denmark or Paris, somewhere in Europe.
Yes, well, I am, yes, my name is Jan Iversen. I'm normally stationed in or located in Aarhus in Denmark at Aarhus University. But right now I happen to be in Paris, working on various projects. I mean, I prepared a small sort of, just to not be too long, about how I and colleagues in Aarhus are working on this. So allow me a disclaimer. I'm very much in relations around different epistemologies, but I have not examined the particular political and ethical platform of sustainable development goals. But I really look forward to that discussion. I'm sure that we, wherever we are positioned, are called on to relate to and speak within this discourse. To engage in intercultural relations means to have in mind the position we are speaking from, be that as researchers embedded in disciplines, as gendered, and not least as located in different cultures and histories. In his semiotic terminology, Walter Mignolo asks to reflect on enunciation or speaker position before content. Decolonizing knowledge is a crucial move for people having suffered the epistemological and other effects of colonialism and are still suffocating under the post-colonial yoke of Western science. Post-colonial thinkers broke the ground for a critique of the colonial legacy, at least also for some of us in Europe, when they unveiled all the absences in science, as well as in many other domains that uphold the power relations on which our modernity still rests. To decolonize knowledge is an important emancipatory step of unveiling the geopolitics of knowledge. There are definitely European and Western critiques of the dark sides of modernity, but the most important voices of Europe from people oppressed and marginalized, whether being in Europe or locations controlled by Europe. As we know or are being told, European knowledge has to be provincialized. Claims that Western science is universal and possessing a zero point of detachment still make domination and exclusion possible. Marginalized thinkers, and these are marginalized from a Western and European point of view, have demonstrated this for a very long time, both as the historian that I am and as a scholar embedded in Western science. I try to capture and listen to the marginal voices inside or outside Europe, calling us from the past and from the present. From my position, decolonizing knowledge means listening to these voices and reflecting on the effects they have on the understanding of knowledge within institutions that I in some way represent. We need to move from decolonizing knowledge to decolonial knowledge. Even if most knowledge moves from the global north to the global south, some knowledge is also moving in the opposite direction. I try to follow discussions in the global south on knowledge politics. I understand the fears of philosophers such as the Beninese philosopher Bola Utonji of producing ethno-philosophy that lock thinking into essentialist understanding of culture and end up provincializing it. I think he's right in pointing out that knowledge can neither be grounded in a privileged universalist zero point, nor eliminating any right to the universal. As he states, cultural values must be seen as being allowed to float freely. Eliminating universality means returning to an exoticism that in many ways reproduced colonialist ethnography. For this reason, we must think in terms of pluriversality. Intercultural relations are often asymmetrical and oppressive, but they can also lead to changes. The Antillean French thinker Edouard Glissant sees in intercultural relations a possibility to open up for new knowledges. Relations can both be hegemonic and based upon an idea of transparency, as is the case in Western science, or they can be open to the unknown and unexpected. He calls the latter the force of opacity. I am very inspired by the idea that knowledge can only be exchanged if there's a will to engage with opacity. As Glissant beautifully phrases it, I quote, "The thought of the other becomes sterile without the other of thought," end of quote. When it comes to engaging with opacity, the marginalized have a historical advantage because they've been forced to navigate the movement and dominance. Glissant calls this the capacity to creolize. So, I mean, my interest here, in short, is to be involved in the discussion from this point of how can we think of intercultural relations from the perspective of the marginalized. In that case, I'm mainly here to listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a good report from Paris. We plan to go north-south as much as we can. So I'm wondering if Wesley, are you there, or am I?
Yeah, I'm here too.
You're here there. Okay, there you are.
I am.
Okay, are you prepared to tell us who you are and a little bit what you're doing? Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I am Wesley, and I'm from Zimbabwe and a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, a guest researcher at the Center on Law and Transformation in Norway, and I work for GRIP, a global research program on inequality. And so that's briefly who I am and what I do. My research focuses mostly on access to justice, and I have developed an inkling towards decolonial theory and decolonizing African law. So that's sort of the perspective that I'd be speaking from. And as such, I'll dive straight into addressing sort of the decolonizing epistemologies and the SDGs and how I see them relating. So decolonizing epistemologies and the Sustainable Development Goals are closely related in that they both aim to achieve more equitable and just societies. Decolonizing epistemology seeks to challenge the colonial and Eurocentric knowledge systems that have been used to subjugate and marginalize certain communities. While the SDGs involve a global commitment to eradicate extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and protect the environment. Both discourses call for re-examining and re-evaluating the dominant systems of power and knowledge that have been used to maintain oppressions and exploitations around the world. They both offer a way forward to create a more inclusive and equitable, sustainable future. And so in my mind, I want to emphasize then SDG 16 on access to justice in relation to the decolonial project and how it is a complex and ongoing process. But two things strike out, and I want to mention that before I finish, which is the knowledge that we talk about, particularly from an African point of view, is not lost. I think that is perhaps an exaggeration on knowledge that is lost. I think the narrative itself is that the knowledge has been subjected to validation. So a good example is a friend who is a guest researcher at Oxford right now. He hasn't been able to get much headway because he plays the mbira music instrument, which does not have a notation in the same way as Western instruments. And he's been asked to validate that using academic journals that do not exist. And so that knowledge cannot be said to be lost because it hasn't been written down. It is that it is there. And that's where I think the universities can come in, particularly universities in the global South. And they can come in and we can then begin to generate this knowledge in a way that fits the African model, which then leads me to the second point of the term alternative, which I vehemently I disagree with as a term to describe knowledge that is not Western. I think by virtue of the knowledge existing, it means that it cannot be alternative because it already exists. And so just because there's a knowledge that is dominant and being pushed perhaps imperially does not mean that the knowledge becomes alternative. And so I will stop there and we can then continue with the discussion further.
Thank you, Wesley. That was very good. And lots of food for thought. I think we go then north, although you are sitting in Bergen and I'm sitting in South Africa. We have our north-south identities. We go to the north and to be polite, I ask Anders Breili to step up. Are you there? He's a professor at Oslo Met University. I don't know if you were there.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, my point of departure is the questions you sent us to before the conference. So I would like to look first at the SDG goals in relation to Western epistemology. And my focus is indigenous knowledges as an alternative, not alternative maybe, but a supplement to Western knowledge. And indigenous knowledges do not figure in the SDGs at all, not once. And indigenous peoples are not really important either, despite indigenous peoples' strong engagement in the process towards the SDGs. They only refer to 6 times. So the implications of this absence is that epistemological issues are not on the SDGs agenda. Sustainability issues are completely delinked from epistemological issues. And you ask the question, are the SDGs just another twist to the Western hegemony base on Western knowledge? And my answer then is clearly yes. And then the second question is about the Western growth model, if it can be decolonized. And my answer to that is that I think the Western growth model is so ingrained in any discussion on SDGs and climate change that a new paradigm has to be established based not on green growth, but on degrowth. I think there's much to be learned from indigenous people's focus on sustainability and nature, but their knowledges have, as I said, been completely lost in almost all discussions on SDGs and for climate sustainability. Let me also mention a new report that just recently was released called Climate Inequality, issued by Sciences Po in Paris, which exposes what we already know, that sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest emission rates globally, but suffers the worst consequences in terms of climate change and costs. The current discussion on addressing climate change is not sustainable, and the report does not mention indigenous nor degrowth once. So I think that the SDGs is a completely colonized report, and the climate inequality report reflects what I would call climate colonization, where the global north is the big emission sinner and does not actually address sustainability in a serious sense. Then the third issue is the repression of local knowledges. how do we regain local knowledges through decolonizing Western hegemony? And it's not easy. I think it's an uphill battle. We can write books about it. My colleague Krövel and we wrote a book in 2020 called Indigenous Knowledges and the Sustainable Development Agenda. But I think it's more important as to mention that we influence politicians and maybe particularly the ecological movement globally, which does not really include indigenous and degrowth perspectives in the discussions. Research is important, but even in universities, especially in the North, other knowledge systems rather than the Western are often met with skepticism. Maybe I can come back to a research project that I've done together with a PhD student on a dialogue between Western knowledge and indigenous knowledges that we did in South Africa in a science class, but I'll come back to that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. This is the first explicit argument for a conflict between the decolonization discourse and the SDG discourse. I think we will have lots of debate about this. So we now go to a PhD student at University of Bergen who is based in Bergen but half Ugandan. So since we are more Norwegians here on the or Nordic people on this agenda than people on the south, we'll have one in between. Andrea, you have the word about your project, please.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Yeah, and you're also part of this Decolonizing Epistemology project.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, my name is Andrea Felde, and as Tor said, I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Government, and I study intra-organizational political processes in student organization at universities in authoritarian settings. So my focus is on Makerere University in Uganda. And the way I approach this decolonizing epistemologies discourse or debate is by looking at how student leaders understand this decolonizing of epistemologies, how it is perceived, and what is specifically the knowledge problem within decolonization at the university. How they have been outlining epistemic inequalities and injustice, and if they're questioning the universalism in social theory. And the preliminary findings is that we don't see any explicit call to decolonize either the university or epistemologies among student leaders in the student government. And that there is no explicit call to decolonize the university does not suggest that the effect of colonialism and neocolonialism is not resident in the university in Uganda or in the curriculum, nor that the students do not make indirect demands for decolonization in other student struggles on campus. So this lack of calls to decolonize may be explained by the two interrelated dynamics that Jansen and Walters in their book on decolonizing of epistemologies address. So they find that in historically Black universities in South Africa, there were actually no colonial statues to remove during the Rhodes Must Fall and Feast Must Fall movement in 2015 and 2016. And this created a situation where coloniality of knowledge was less visible and less felt in that context. The other point they highlighted was that in these universities where students are financially overwhelmed, student politics and struggles tend to focus on the access to and the costs of higher education, which gives less focus to the intellectual orientation of the university and the curricula. So both in relation to what is taught and how it is taught. So likewise, what we see in Uganda today is students struggle to maintain Makerere as a public university, rather than this focus on decolonization. And they do this by addressing the exclusionary cost of university education. And one of the effects of this exclusionary cost is a student, mainly girls, selling their bodies in order to afford tuition fees. So in this way, I think that the discourse on decolonizing epistemologies can relate to many of the Sustainable Development Goals, or at least the focuses of the Sustainable Development Goals. Among others, Goal 4 on quality education, number 5 on gender inequality, and number 10 on reduced inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then we go to the True South, University of Limpopo, I think. If Mbambu Kekana is here, I don't know if I pronounced the name right, but are you here or are you somewhere else?
I am in South Africa.
Yes, there you are.
At the University of Limpopo. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Nongceba. Mbambu Kekana is my surname. I'm the Director for Internationalization at the University of Limpopo, responsible, amongst other things, in establishment of partnerships with the partners that we want to do research with, and also these SDGs, solutions around SDGs. My take on the topic, I think I will echo the one but last speaker, and also a bit of what Wesley brought up in his talk. Because according to one of the questions that were posed in the emails as we were preparing for this conference, was that are SDGs just another twist to the Western hegemony based on Western knowledge? And I want to believe that if we do not interrogate the SDGs in that sense, they have a potential to be. And I also, in the UNESCO report, there is somewhere where that is suggested that maybe we need to interrogate for future how these SDGs are. But my take is somewhat different, because what comes to mind, or to my mind, in terms of this topic, as we're talking about decolonizing knowledge, is the way of knowing, or the knowledge that was used, first of all, to come to the word development in the SDGs. In other words, what was the intention when you're talking about development, and what epistemologies were involved? Was the development intended, therefore, to be an addition to the populations that are deemed to need such, which I would argue could have been a Western epistemology? Or was the intention to create growth and positive change in the existing environments? I didn't know how to categorize the latter epistemology, I think, as Wesley puts it. However, in the report, there's a reference to mainstream Western knowledge and other forms or alternative knowledge forms. This may be interpreted, as I think Wesley is doing, so that Western knowledge remains and the other knowledges are an add-on. Whereas knowledge, as I understand, is co-created, involving all forms, and it does exist. Secondly, on the SDGs being another twist, for the first time, as I looked at this topic, I interrogated the pictures that are used for the 17 SDGs by the UN. When I look at their website, goals 1 to 6 have pictures of people, not necessarily depicting the goals per se, but portraying the people as indicators of the goals. Goal 1, for instance, has a picture of a beautiful African young girl neatly dressed, standing next to a sofa at home. What is it then that depicts poverty in that picture, except that the girl is African? Goal 2 has a picture of African young healthy boys standing next to a window of a building, one holding a baby, smiling. What then depicts hunger in that picture, except that these are African boys? Goal 4 has a girl writing on a chalkboard. Does the chalkboard depict lack of quality of education, except that the girl is an Indian girl? So the question for me remains, what epistemology was used to inform the SDGs? And I would argue, what epistemologies were used to propose the solutions? It would have been better, in my view, to continue in that trajectory of those pictures, to depict goals 8 and 11, as you talk about decent work, innovation, and so on. So if I may, goal 11 talks about sustainable cities and human settlement. And the explanation talks about cities being hubs of ideas, commerce, culture, and so on. And I would argue that rural areas and other settlements are hubs in themselves. They have all that exists in the cities and even have their own indigenous knowledges. But there is no talk of rural development, but urban planning, transport systems, and everything else when there is a talk about improving cities. The question, therefore, is, are the SDGs in the business of shaping others to reject their origin and accept modernity or the so-called civilization, or are they in the business of creating positive change? Knowledge, I argue, should be decolonized by accepting all knowledge as mainstream, having a solution in different contexts so that we can have effective solutions that make a difference to the people who are being assisted rather than us trying to achieve the goals. And I think that the universities, as we teach our students to become leaders of tomorrow, we need to take the students and teach them in the way that makes them co-creators of knowledge. When we do research, we include those that are being researched as co-creators of knowledge of that research. And as we develop solutions, we take along the societies and communities for whom the solutions are targeted for, to be part of those solutions, using what they already know and what they already are using as forms of survival. Because as we come with solutions, those people are not sitting, they are in the process of finding ways of survival. I think I will leave it there for now and would come back in on other issues. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And thank you very much for these thought-provoking observations and ideas. I'm sure we will have a discussion about them as we go along. The last speaker then, as far as I can see, will be Lise Rachner, who is the project leader of this epistemology project. Lise, I know you're here because we're in the same room, so please go ahead.
Sorry about that. Because we are in the same room, there is echo, so we are very concerned about being muted and not muted. So first of all, thank you, Tor, for not only giving me this opportunity to speak to this incredibly interesting debate, but also for hosting me, since I did not have access to internet this time of the day. So my name is Lise Rachner. I'm a professor of political science, Department of Government, University of Bergen. And as Tor said, I am the PI of this Decolonizing Epistemology project, which is based as a collaboration between University of Bergen and Macquarie University, but it's mainly around the PhD program at MISER, at Makerere. There is a third partner in our research, which is University of Western Cape. And we have now, for this has been our first week where we actually met as a project group here. And our discussions have started here in South Africa on teachers and deans and administrators at university experiences with with implementing a decolonized curriculum agenda, because South Africa have had enormous sort of, what can I say, the social movements have given the South African universities an energy to start this decolonizing debate that I think many other places lack, like as Andrea talked about Uganda. So that doesn't mean that these discussions are not important and vital and ongoing, but the South African ones have come at a particular moment because there's been this incredible social energy that sort of ignited these processes. And so what we've been doing for the last week or so is to actually really interrogate, well, what happens when enormous social energy, social movements, protests, big movements is translated into university institutions that by nature are institutions that by nature have a conservative mode. So things, because in universities across the world, things slow down. And this is how, and this has given me a profound sort of way, knowledge or questions, I think I should more say, but how can you actually, are universities, as UNESCO says, the UNESCO report says at the start that higher education institutions are uniquely situated to contribute to the social, economic, and environmental transformation required to tackle the world's most pressing issues. Now, that is how UNESCO sort of depicts us as higher learning institution and as higher learning teachers. My question is really, if that is the case, and to what are the kind of the forces working against that? And I'm been really fascinating, and I think one José's point about moving from a narrative of competition to a narrative of collaboration would probably be maybe the most important starting point, because what we meet, what our project and what our meetings have really told us and really sort of illustrated with great force is how all these debates are fraught with ambiguities. The link, I think, between the SDG agenda and the decolonizing debate is that there is a lack of will or ability or space to really focus on the underlying structural dilemmas and the structural inequalities that are, that are underlying the agenda. And I think we tend to move, with not really interrogating the substance of the SDGs or the substance of the concept of decolonization, we move very quickly to sort of finding solutions, finding boxes to tick, finding, small changes. So, we change the curriculum, we do this, how many % of the literature is indigenous and how many is from African authors or Northern South. And so, we just move before having that sort of grounded debate about what are the structural forces underlying this, what needs to change. We move quickly to this sort of institutionalized, by saying box ticking, it sounds like I'm sort of belittling the work that's being done. But my point is, there is a danger of moving far too quickly into the solvable issues. And I think this means that these ambiguities within these concepts, we don't really interrogate them because we move so quickly away from the structural factors. So I think that would be, for me, one of the sort of the most profound debates that we really have sort of just glossed over. A few other things that I find, I mean, we talk about localizing knowledge, and I think local knowledge and localizing knowledge is a key element in the decolonizing epistemology debate, but also should be in the SDGs. But what does it really mean to localize knowledge? Because local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is a knowledge that is it's evolving, and it is evolving in a conversation with the global. And so there is no such thing as a kind of a, sort of an untainted or sort of untouched indigenous or local knowledge and a sort of global. It's always kind of evolving in a conversation with each other. And so the question is, how is this conversation and how is this development taking place? I'm wary of a debate that focuses so much on the local that we lose the global. So to put it mildly, so if, for instance, universities in the global south become so concerned with sort of kind of nurturing the local, we may end up in a situation where the communicate, where the dialogue is not there. So unless the local knowledge from the south becomes part of the global academic discourse and curriculum, we haven't really solved any issue. So I think I worry about sort of decoupling, and I'm really concerned about this coupling of the global and the local conversation. And I also think that it's the whole concept of global needs to be sort of problematized, because we tend to think of it as a kind of a northern discourse. But I think that is, by doing it that way, by using global as a sort of synonym word for Western, or then we're really losing this possibility or potential for a dialogue. There are some incredible and incredibly complex, small, ambiguities again in this debate. Because I mean, Nanseba, you're saying something about the importance of mainstreaming all knowledge, and I agree with that. But I think let's not undermine and underestimate the power of being the mainstream knowledge. How do we make sure that we mainstream all knowledge, and who gets to decide? So, for instance, the conversations here for instance, at the University of Western Cape, where you have people saying, well, our students are going out and they are competing on a job market, and where there are specific demands for knowledge. And this knowledge is, in a sense, very, you could say it's based on a kind of a British colonial agenda. But again, that is the kind of market the students are competing on. How do we sort of investigate this and meet this competition? Again, I mean, it would be wonderful if we could have a collaboration more than a competition. But I also think we have to realize, and we have to be quite wary of the kind of the debates that the students are, and they are meeting at the workforces. So what I'm saying is that this is not easy, and that doesn't mean that it's not important. That's exactly why it's important. But I do think that the entire SDG agenda, and unfortunately, maybe also so far the decolonizing debate, has an unfortunate sort of tendency to move from the complex, because we don't really have quick answers, to move into a phase where we try to solve things and fix things. And that's when we end up in box ticking. So I think it's like that. I think we need to actually open for a much more complex and hurtful and debate that maybe we don't really have the answers to. But to be honest about the fact that both the decolonizing debate and the SDG debate is about underlying incredibly forceful economic structures that unless we really discuss and debate and tackle these, we're not really going to move much, much forward. So I think that would be my sort of complex and a little bit confused way into this, but that's exactly where we are in our research project. And thank you very much, Tor, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Lisa. Let me just add for the record that this project is a NORAD project, in other words, funded by NORAD, and it's part of a NORAD program, which I think contributes to the decolonization of knowledge. At least our project brings a lot of knowledge from the South to us in the North and influences the way we think. But we can get back to that later. There are so many things that have come up during this session, and it's now open for everybody to take part. I hope you have questions. You can just raise your hand. And in the meantime, if any of us in the panel wants to say something, it's also possible. And we have the discussion here on the meeting chat. There are questions there that can be answered. So I hope there is debate possible here. We have had the question of economic growth versus degrowth. We've had the question of what about the mainstream Western knowledge? Do we transform it, and or do we discard it? How do we handle the global knowledge domination? How do we develop local knowledge to become acceptable and academic enough to be seen as valuable? And also the main question, is decolonizing knowledge contrary to the SDGs? Are the SDGs really made in the frame of the Western way of thinking too much or to a too high extent? And then can we influence the SDGs to become more global, or do we have to throw them out, do something else? No, it's Jan, please go ahead. I thought Andrea was looking after the hands, but Jan, please go ahead. I heard you have your hand up.
Well, thank you again for being invited to and listening to these very interesting talks. As I just mentioned when I was talking myself, I'm a historian. So I'm also very much interested in how these discussions have taken shape in the past. And I want to remind ourselves, and also being very much sort of influenced by it in my own thinking, that there are lots of discussions that have already been taking place about the local and the global when it came to how to become independent. I mean, the whole independence movement, for instance, in Africa, was very much about how to de-link and how to relink. So how to deal with the sort of the import or the influences from the colonizers, and how to get rid of the influences from the colonizers. So if you look at the discussions that have been going on post-independence, for instance, among African intellectuals, I mean, taking up the ideas that already Frantz Fanon came up with in 1961 with his book on the Damnés de la Terre, the wretched on earth, that in Africa we need to create, or you need to create, a new humanity. Is also a way of trying to get rid of it, but also opening up. And you have a number of thinkers like Jonji, you have Katibi from Morocco, you have Albert Memmi from Algeria, that are all sort of thinking about this kind of how to separate, how to de-link, how to create knowledge which does not risk becoming just local. And the problem is to But localized knowledge is also in the risk of being essentialized. This is our knowledge. This is African philosophy. This is Chinese philosophy, etc. And they are in fact favoring that dialogue. So there's a long sort of long discussion among post-colonial thinkers, African thinkers, Latin American thinkers, Caribbean thinkers, etc., on how to sort of avoid the trap of being localized, trying to open up the dialogue. So I think it's worthwhile also considering these voices that have been sort of that have been expressed over the last 60, 70 years among post-colonial intellectuals. I mean, even the first generation of post-colonial intellectuals, like Aimé Césaire in France or Fanon or others. So we don't need to invent, or there's no reason to invent something that's, I mean, the debates on decolonizing knowledge has been there from the beginning, from the claim of independence, from the independence movement. So I think we should listen to these independent thinkers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. We are absolutely concerned about these thinkers, and I think they are truly important. We have people in our projects who work on Fanon and so on, but they are so little ingrained in the curriculum, the ordinary curriculum of the West. They have not gained a voice in for example, the philosophy departments, the history departments do not have any recollection of these people. So how do you think we should how do you think we should go about to have them integrated in the ordinary pensum?
Wesley på listen din,
Ja.
Og så har du Hans Geir og Fredrik.
Okay.
Jeg skal lage listen for det.
Well, I was just informed about all the people who have raised their hand. I can't see them except for, but you will come on. I'll let Jan answer this question first, because we are wondering about that. How do we get them on the curriculum? It's a fight.
But we need to, I mean, I'm mostly interested in how we can open up our curriculums in our home universities in Europe. So how can we put these thinkers on the agenda? Why don't we have in philosophy, why don't we have African philosophers or philosophers from South America sort of represented? So it's a sort of breaking up our own curriculums is a major task. Just having the voices being there is, I mean, in that sense, we continue silencing important voices. So I think it's difficult to come in and say, now let's speak about indigenous knowledge, since that debate's been on the table for 70 years. So what has been said, what has been expressed? Why is Utonji so critical about ethnophilosophy, for instance? What does he say? Why does he want to be a philosopher and not just somebody speaking African culture, which he says does not exist because it's about diversity? So that is what we need to put into it. So we here in the global north, my own place in Aarhus, Denmark, we need to not blow up our curricula, but at least fuse into it voices that are not heard. Thank you.
So I'm just gonna, because Tor has a kind of a different setup on his computer, so he doesn't see your hands. So the next hand is Wesley, then it's Hans Geir, and then it's Frederick. And so I will just take over that part of the job. And then, but Tor is still sharing. I'm the only one seeing the yellow hand.
Thank you, Lisa. So please, Wesley.
Thank you. So there are a few things to mention. And the first one, I think, is the starting point, which is if we go back to the SDGs. I looked it up preparing for this to say, you know, at least in my sort of where I'm coming from, I wanted to see if at least the African Union contributed to the development of the SDGs. And indeed, they contributed. I suppose we can go into a whole debate about, you know, what informs what their priorities were in relation to the ways of knowing. And one conclusion I came up with was possibly that they are politicians and they are possibly not the best people to have contributed to the development of the SDGs. Which then brings me to the second point, and I'd like to emphasize this very much. When we're talking about ways of knowing and epistemic justice, I think we have to separate sort of global North universities from global South universities. I think if we do that as a starting point, we then start to see that a university, the University of Cape Town, or the University of the Western Cape, or Makerere, vis-a-vis the University of Bergen or Harvard, when we're talking about what decolonization is and what it means, it will mean very different things to those different institutions, primarily because they are in different operating environments. And I think if we accept that knowledge is part of the colonial project, and it is very much alive right now, we still have what the UNESCO report was called that power shapes truth. And so at the last Bergen exchanges, we had Sylvia Tamale, who highlighted that, you know, a lot of her colleagues from the Global North send her a research project that has objectives and potential outcomes that already has Horizon Europe funding. And they ask her to be a part of it as a collaborator. And luckily, she has achieved a lot as a professor. So she has the leeway to turn those down. But she was highlighting it to say that that is not co-production of knowledge. That is not collaboration. If you've already received funding and you're going to another professor who is also accomplished and you're telling them, be my collaborator, and yet the only thing that they're contributing to that is effectively data collection. And then the professor in the North is the one who is theorizing. At that point, we then have the saying of, you know, he who feeds you owns you. Which again feeds into this colonial sort of narrative and the colonial project. And then to the issue is tied to the local universities. And I want to emphasize as well that for me, the challenge that we have with going global before we understand the local is that anything that then is produced in comparison to what already exists. So for example, if we're talking about philosophy and Ubuntu, you have a lot of people who either don't understand what it is, or they compare it with another philosophy and another philosophical approach, which is different from the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which distorts it, because now instead of us only understanding it as it is, we're understanding it in relation to another. And so before we move to global, we've got to understand the epistemology or the way of knowing of these local places so that we don't risk losing a lot when we are comparing. Then finally, it's on, I'm shocked that we are talking about changing curriculums in the global North as a big task, when on this panel alone, we have professors who set required readings. And so to me, and it's something that we started doing when Roads Must Fall started at the University of Cape Town, which was to say, change the readings. You know, an example I like to give a lot is how at the University of Cape Town, they were not prescribing Achimafeji in a philosophy or in anthropology. And yet he's one person that they could have. Same thing with the UN and UNESCO. We move away from the developmental state and the Lagos plans in 1980, which led us to the structural adjustment programs that were disastrous for African countries and continue to be disastrous to this day. But we know for a fact that we had African scholars who had come up with a development plan in the early 80s. And that knowledge was completely just rubbished. And neither has there been acknowledgement that, you know, once the Asian countries went that developmental route, that indeed the Africans were correct in the first place. And that way of knowing has been effectively lost, although the documents are there. And it's not taught in any economics class that these guys came up with these things. And so I think I will conclude as well by saying something that we were talking about in the chat, to say Nontleba, and I think it's important to say what you were saying and what I said about the alternative view is not thought-provoking. It's not thought-provoking because it exists. The fact that it surprises people should be the thing that is thought-provoking because it already exists. And we have to emphasize that all the time, so that when we say indigenous people, are we talking about me as a Zimbabwean, or are we only talking about Canadian Indians or the people living in the Amazon? It becomes quite ambiguous as well. And so words matter. And so we have to be careful about the words that we choose to describe things, because that also takes away from the knowledge. Thank you, too.
Thank you, Wesley. Then I think it's Frederick, and after that it's Hans-Geir. So Frederick Brossard, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I am a professor of education and work in Norway. I'm French, but I've been living for a long time in Norway. And what I would like to say here, and maybe it's a suggestion and also it's a critique towards the Norwegian system, because I think that, as you were mentioning, the voices of the South are very important. And actually many migrants also came to Norway, and they're coming from the South. And what do we do now in Norway regarding their own knowledge? It is really becoming invisible in the education. And we were talking about how to localize the knowledge. But actually, in Norway, for instance, we have been talking very much about the Sami, and of course it is very fundamental as a knowledge, but we are not showing respect and actually interest for other types of knowledge from the migrants, from the immigrants that are living in Norway. Mother tongue education, for instance, has been strongly weakened through the curriculum at school. And this is something that is happening in Norway, but it has been also in Denmark and in many other countries. Actually, the local knowledge that they have when they are living in Norway, being used to live with the sun, being used to produce other types of food, all these kind of things could be something that we could talk in mother tongue education. The bilingual teachers have been heavily discriminated in a study, for instance, that we made and published last year. They are heavily discriminated today, that their language and their knowledge at school is not being respected at all. In Oslo, for instance, there is almost no mother education taught now at school. So I would say that a way also to decolonize the curriculum here in the Norwegian context would be then to really give a much stronger support to mother tongue education, and how also to include this topic at the university in order to make visible the value of this knowledge at school, and to taught our students to do so. Thank you. And the intercultural thinking that and reflection would be very much something that we could highlight also through concrete examples such as mother tongue education. Thank you.
Thank you for these thoughts, and what a challenge for us in Bergen. Hans-Geir, you are next, and then afterwards is Sanum Habibullah something. The last name disappeared for me. Okay, Hans-Geir, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I come from the study of religion, and I also come from Norway. So I wanted to say two things. The first was related to what was said earlier by Wesley and also Jan, I think. Questions about concepts that we used and narratives that we are kind of living inside and communicating by our actions and words. You know, we talk about decolonizing epistemology, and both of these words are very kind of embedded European words that say something about the world that we live in. Epistemology, a Greek word coming from Greek philosophy, Greek thinking. And we also talked about African philosophy, Wesley mentioned. And the idea of what philosophy is also very much embedded in European culture and this Western Eurocentric way of thinking. A couple of colleagues of mine were trying to write a book about non-Western philosophers and philosophies, and very easily ended up with criticism that they were not really philosophers, these people. They were kind of religious. They came from a Confucianism or Buddhism or some kind of indigenous traditions, so not accepted as real philosophy, you know. So we have a long way to go to decolonize ourselves up here and our way of thinking. So I very much agree with much what have been said lately. But I also wanted to say something else, that we are in a heavy company, and there are many elephants in the room here when we talk about the SDGs and decolonization, because there are other factors at play. Of course, we know everyone very well about the global economy and capitalism as a huge factor in colonizing processes. But coming from the study of religion, I now am working on a project which involves 900 million evangelical Christians that have a big, huge project about evangelization and mission towards the unreached peoples, as they say, which first and foremost include indigenous peoples, but also mission directed towards many spheres of society in many different parts of the world. So when we talk about decolonizing epistemologies, we are kind of a little bit talking about a bubble here. So you're asking maybe Toran and Lisa, then what are we as kind of an academic world? How can we deal with this within kind of our mutual communication and collaboration and so on? That is one thing, but we also have to see the world we are living in. We have heavy competition from many actors and factors that play a huge role. And I wonder how we are going to talk about this without mentioning mission, for instance, from Christians particularly, but also Islam and other religions, of course, and also capitalist politics, human rights, for instance, and the idea of knowledge itself. How do you sort of differentiate knowledge from local knowledge, as has been mentioned before? Global knowledge, local knowledges, and so on. There were many comments there, but mainly I wanted to say these multiple processes of colonization that are still going on, that we also have to fight at the same kind of, or do something with at the same time, all relating to kind of processing the SDGs then. Not sure if this made sense. I had too many things there, I think. Anyway, thanks.
It made a lot of sense to us. I think also that Jan talked about, that we have to think of how the colonizers still are existent in this world. And your book on Pentecostalism is very important for us, because we see in Uganda, for example, how Pentecostalism is growing more than ever. So, but through centers from the US or something. Okay, we go to Sonam. Please go ahead. You have to turn on the mic, Sonam.
Thank you so much, sir. Basically, I was a little bit shy speaking to such great speakers. Like you all seniors, I respect you all. Thank you so much. It was pretty fruitful. So I was listening to all the speakers about like the curricula and the decolonization. So what I, as an activist, like we are on the ground, and we are seeing that how much things have been changed. Like this people from Indus Valley civilization, we are having some sort of like there are the rules, the way people are welcoming and waiting for the immigrant birds to come, and the way they treat them. Like recently there was a social activist, Nazim Jokio, he was killed just trying to protect a bird. immigrant bird from, the people who were, who came there to hunt the birds from some other country. Our curriculum, like if we talk about the curriculums, maybe different civilizations, people in different areas, like if we decode the Egyptian text as well, maybe we will find their own curriculum, the way they were teaching the ethics and the way they have to treat their nature and their land. So maybe we will find so many things from other civilizations as well, or maybe there are texts we are not putting more efforts into those curriculums, the way they are helping their people to learn and love the nature and other species who are around us. If we will put more efforts into what is already available in their languages, in whatever they have, and the local people who are there already protecting it, so maybe we will get more different results, rather than our focus, like the government's focus and the focus of the policies is on how much the cities are producing and how to stop that. If our focus will be on more on the like globally, if we are giving the importance to the people, the civilizations who are growing, if the city life is basically, the city life is more like we can say that in the emission, in producing the fuel consumption and everything, that is more, maybe if we will encourage people, the already people who are serving there, they are having more knowledge on the nature and the things they are, the way they are protecting it. If their generations will be discouraged and they will start moving from their city life is already evolving, developing, that's I think the more important thing, that is more alarming, where like things, if we, even if we look at the countries, maybe I'm not too good at expressing things, maybe in the countries where people are moving more, like the number of immigration in even Pakistan, in Sindh as well, from Afghanistan people are coming, so maybe they all are going to the cities. So if in the same manner in different part of the world, maybe in the Europe as well, people are moving more, so over there as well, if we're talking about the problems where we are saying that there are not, maybe those all problem will start start over there as well, because we are not using the information, we are not using the things which we already have, the text, the literature, the knowledge at the places where there it was, and it was more useful to us, the people who are protecting the nature, the people who are protecting all these things. Maybe it is also eradicating from one generation to another generation. Maybe they will listen, and after the third generation it will be removed. So so the knowledge in the text and the literature which already is there, if it is not acknowledged, if it is not protected, if it is not added into the curriculums, if it is not added into the education systems of those all countries and globally, maybe I believe that it will create problem, because the solution which they have, maybe we are not acknowledging them. Like we are looking for solutions and problems which are, we think that these are the current problems, we will solve them, and then we will look into the problems which they had. I think throughout the things have been same. Maybe their perspective of looking into the solution was different than what we have.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a crucial issue, and
Thank you.
And we are of course aware of these problems in particularly in the agricultural knowledge, which is Western produced, which always forces industrialized agriculture and is not listening to local knowledge about how soil and earth and the water systems are locally, has led to many problems, as you say in your side comment here. So this is a key issue for on the meeting between the SDGs and the decolonization project. We have a few minutes left. So the question is, do anybody have a very important comment at the end? that they want to share with us? Okay, Anders, please. You didn't raise your hand physically, not in the but you go ahead, Anders. Anders, you have to unmute.
Okay. There's been a lot of discussion about the curriculum, and I think Wesley was shocked that you couldn't change the curriculum very easily. I think we have done that to a certain extent in our department, but in Oslo there has been a big debate about, you know, including other works, outside the Western canon, and there's been a lot of debate and a lot of resistance. There is a positivist element, I think, in the discussion, which has dismayed me, and it's not easy to change. I've been teaching a lot in Africa, and it was interesting to see that the students didn't know of any non-Western scholars on the curriculum. So when we included Fanon, Césaire, and so on, there was a change in motivation, I think, among the students, which was important. So I think it is extremely important that local knowledge, local scholars are included in the curriculum, not only in the university, but from the primary school. If you look at the curriculum in the primary and secondary school in most sub-Saharan African countries, it is a Western curriculum, and the learning outcomes are extremely low. I think the average literacy rate among secondary school leavers, for example, in South Africa, is maybe 5 to 10%. And this is due to the fact that they feel that the school is an alienating place where their own knowledge, their own culture, their own language is not taken into account. So this inclusion of indigenous knowledges is a very urgent issue, because if you don't have an educated population, how can you talk about development and sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders. That was a good reminder at the end of this session. We have 1.5 hours and we have spent the time. I think we will be blocked after a few minutes. Let me thank you all for participating. It's too bad we didn't have more time. So many of you should have been talking. But I think that to finalize the session, the SDGs gives us a different development model than the Western growth model. Of course, you have to have economic growth in many countries, but not in the Western world and not in the rich world. The SDGs gives us the eco-social model, which says that you have to take ecology and inequality into consideration in every economic act. And to manage that, we need the North-South relations, and we need to make sure that the North-South relations divide resources differently than it has so far. And we need the local knowledge from other parts of the world than the Western. Knowledge is contextual. Knowledge is often local, developed to become generalizable. And as Anders mentioned, too many of the Western knowledge people are positivist. They think there is only one right answer to every question. Of course, we know that knowledge varies. Knowledge is contextual, developed in a context, and gives different meaning in different contexts. This is a debate that the SDG opens up for, and it's the debate we have in the decolonization debate. And I think there are many meeting points between these two discourses, but there may also be contradiction, as some of you have argued. We will continue this debate, and I hope many of you can take part in it. and that we will come up with some good reasonings, good knowledges in the time to come. So thank you very much, all of you, for participating. This is just a beginning of the debate. I hope we can continue later on. Thank you very much.